Our featured guest speaker today is Ed Brayton, the founder of FreethoughtBlogs and the blogger of Dispatches from the Culture Wars, and with a presentation entitled Why Atheism Is Not Enough. So, about Ed, a little more information about his background. He spent several years touring the country as a stand-up comedian, and Ed got tired of explaining his jokes to small groups of dazed illiterates and turned to writing as the most common outlet for the voices in his head. He has appeared on the Rachel Maddow Show and the Thom Hartmann Show, and is almost certain that he is the only person ever to make fun of Chuck Norris on C-SPAN. So, please welcome our guest speaker today, Ed Brayton.
Just need to be here. There's okay. Thank you all for coming out, and thanks, Vic, for that slightly outdated introduction. I am no longer the media relations coordinator for Foundation Beyond Belief, but it's still a huge supporter and a volunteer, and I have actually going to be talking about this organization during my talk tonight. Right up front, let me say, please forgive me if I nod off at any time during this. I'm exhausted from a great deal of travel, and I just realized that this is the beginning of a 48-hour stretch where I give 3 talks and do a TV taping in 3 different cities. So, I'm not as exhausted as I will be by Sunday night, at least. And this is a kind of a personal talk for me. This was something that had percolated inside my brain for quite some time before I started writing it down. And a lot of it goes back to my childhood. I had a rather weird religious upbringing. My father is an atheist. My stepmother, who was really the woman who raised me, is Pentecostal. And in January, they will celebrate their 40th anniversary. Don't ask me how it works. It was a very odd way to be brought up, and as a teenager, I was a Christian. In fact, I was one of the leaders of the local Youth for Christ in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And about 16 years old, as a lot of people do, I started asking some questions. It started to not make sense to me, and getting very bad answers to those questions. And so I embarked on about a year and a half of serious study of Christianity, and after spending hundreds and hundreds of hours talking about it, researching it, thinking about it, I ultimately decided I just couldn't believe this anymore. So by the age of 18, I was an atheist. And it didn't take long for me to become an activist as well. While I was in college, a friend of mine with whom I argued quite a bit about evolution and creationism, because he was a creationist, decided to take me to see a seminar by the rather fiendish and vapid Dr. Kent Hovind. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his rather twisted view of the world. And that sort of motivated me to get involved in fighting creationism. And so I started working with a few years later with the Talk Origins Archive and doing some other things. But I've been an activist my entire adult life, an atheist activist. But a few years ago, the nature of that activism really began to shift. And after spending, like 20 years attacking religion, basically as my only thing that I was doing, it started to occur to me that maybe this just wasn't enough. It's important to criticize religion, and I still do it, and I certainly have no intention of stopping. But after spending so many years fighting just against something, it started to dawn on me that maybe we ought to start providing an alternative to the thing that we're criticizing. That we probably ought to start fighting for something and not just against something. And there were a few epiphanies along the way, and as I said, this is kind of a personal journey that pushed me in this direction. And the first was that in 2009, I had the remarkable opportunity to meet Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And this is not a college crowd. I do a lot of speaking to college crowds where I get blank looks when I say Desmond Tutu, because they don't seem to know who he is, but I'm sure most of you do. And not only did I get to meet him, but I got to spend several hours with him. He came to Michigan State University to give the commencement speech. And one of my good friends is the Episcopalian leader on that campus. And so she got me an invitation to this very small gathering of about 15 people. And we just sat around a table with him and talked. And Bishop Tutu is a remarkable guy. He didn't stop with apartheid. You know, once he got apartheid overturned, he didn't stop there. He became a very outspoken advocate for women's rights, for gay rights, for oppressed people all over the world. And so for me, this was sort of like meeting Martin Luther King or Sojourner Truth. You know, this is a guy that in my very own lifetime literally put his life on the line to fight for justice and equality. And as we sat there, it occurred to me that we agree on almost everything. I mean, obviously, I'm an atheist and he's a Christian, but when it comes to issues that really matter to me, we're in almost complete agreement on all of these issues. And so I mentioned that to him. And he said to me that he does what he does because he believes that's what Jesus would do if he were alive today. And he talked about the woman at the well, and let he who is without sin cast the first stone, and so forth. And he mentioned my favorite verse in the Bible. And yes, even an atheist like me has a favorite verse in the Bible. And it's when Jesus says to his followers, "Whatever you do to the least of these, my brothers, you do unto me also." Now, you don't have to be a Christian to find that a very powerful statement, I think, of human compassion. And he said to me, "I don't care where we start from. I care where we end up. And if we end up both wanting to make the world a better place, then I say we join arms and do it." And so that was kind of the first thing that started nudging me in that direction. And in particular, it got me thinking, I mean, this wasn't an entirely new thought to me. Like I said, one of my dear friends was the Episcopalian leader on the campus that organized this. So, and she and I and other friends had volunteered at homeless shelters and marched for gay rights and so forth. So it wasn't a new thought to me entirely, but it really started me thinking about interfaith cooperation. That when it comes to projects that we equally believe in, regardless of our starting points, that this is something we should get more involved with. And I don't just mean on an individual level. I mean on an institutional level, on a community level. Because by combining our resources together, money, time, volunteers, we can magnify the impact of our actions. And then 2 years ago, I spoke on behalf of CFI Michigan, an organization, Center for Inquiry of Michigan, which I'm on the board of, at an annual Interfaith Thanksgiving dinner or service in Grand Rapids. So this has been going for almost 20 years now. And I've gone to it several times. And they asked me to speak on behalf of CFI, so I did. And I got up and I said, you know, I think it's time that we did more than just get together once a year and say nice things about one another. Why don't we start pooling our resources? Why don't we start working together all year long on doing service projects that will help improve the Grand Rapids community? And about 20 minutes after I gave my talk, which was just 5 minutes is all I had, a local Buddhist monk got up and gave a much longer, much more detailed, and much more eloquent talk on the same subject and suggested that we do the same thing. And there's an organization there that organizes this service every year called the Kaufman Interfaith Center. And so they kind of picked up this idea and ran with it. And they declared 2015, or June 2015 to June 2016, to be the year of interfaith service. And so Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist, we all got together and worked on Habitat for Humanity house builds and things like that. And then after it was supposed to be done, they said, you know what, let's just keep going. There's no reason to end this. And so it is now a permanent thing in the Grand Rapids area. And I'm proud to have played at least a small role in helping get that done. So meeting Bishop Tutu was one of the milestones that sort of pushed me to be more than an atheist, but to be an activist for humanism as well. And another big influence on me in this regard was someone I'm sure most of you know of, Dale McGowan. who founded the Foundation Beyond Belief. And he's best known for Parenting Beyond Belief, probably the book that he wrote about how to raise secular children. Dale had long been concerned about the fact that religious people give more money to charity, and they do, and not just to their churches, but to real charity. And he didn't think that was because atheists or secular-minded people are less generous than religious people. We're not. He figured out that it was because they had more of an opportunity to give, that every Sunday in many churches they're being asked and the plate's being passed to support an orphanage or a hunger project or whatever. And so he said, how about if we start passing the plate among atheists and humanists and give them that opportunity to be giving steadily? And so that was sort of the idea behind Foundation Beyond Belief. And the way it works is that you sign up with the organization and you make a monthly pledge, $10, $20, whatever it is. And then every quarter, the staff at the foundation vets nonprofit organizations, charities in the United States and around the world in 5 areas. Environment, remind me, well, education, environment, poverty and health.
You've got
natural world. Yeah, that's environment.
Human rights.
Challenge the Gap. And the Challenge the Gap, which is a grant that goes to a religious organization doing good work that does not proselytize in any way. And that was a little controversial when they started it out, but I think it's a great idea. And then every quarter, as a contributor to Foundation Beyond Belief, you can go and log into the website and say, okay, this is the one that really touches me. I want my money to go to them, or these 2, or all 5. So you can kind of decide for yourself after they've been thoroughly vetted by the staff, and they put in a lot of work vetting all of these charities to make sure that, the money's limited. You want to get the most bang for your buck. And in the last 5 years, Foundation Beyond Belief has raised more than $2 million for charitable causes, things that really make a difference from the atheist and humanist community. Now, full disclosure, I used to work for them, as Vic said, and I still do some volunteer work for them. And when I went to work for them, 4 years ago? Something like that, 3 or 4 years ago? I wasn't looking for a job. It was only 5 hours a week. It wasn't a lot, a big commitment. But it was the opportunity to work with Dale that made me apply for it in the first place. Because I really strongly supported what he was doing, and it's a decision I'm very happy to have made. There are few people who can express the ideals of humanism as eloquently and passionately as he can. And what I've learned from him in the last few years really is enormous and valuable. And in 2014, I organized the group's first annual conference, which was the Humanism at Work Conference in Chicago. And we chose that title because it really expressed the core principle of the organization, that it doesn't do much good to sit around and talk about our ideals of compassion if you're not going to do anything to put them into action. Humanism is not just a set of ideas, or at least it shouldn't be. It also has to be a set of actions. Some Christians, you hear this a lot, faith without works is dead, right? Same thing's true of humanism. If our humanist ideals are just going to be words on a page or something you hang on the wall and then don't do anything to make them part of the real world, your words don't mean a damn thing. And one of the things that Dale likes to say is, atheism is the first step, humanism is the next 1,000 steps. One of the things that the foundation has done that I'm really most proud of, just having played a tiny little role in helping mostly raise funds for, is something called the Humanist Service Corps, which is a secular humanist alternative to the Peace Corps. There's a young man named Connor Robinson who graduated from Yale a few years ago, and he didn't just want to go get a job. He wanted to do something that was really fulfilling and made an impact on people's lives. And he approached Dale McGowan with this idea of doing this and asked if Foundation Beyond Belief would be sort of the parent, organization to house that. And Dale said yes. And it's really amazing what they do. It's a different approach from traditional, certainly a different approach from religious missionary work. but a different approach from the Peace Corps as well, in that the goal is not to sort of come in as white saviors and fix all of their problems. The goal is to learn from the local people and then to give them tools so that when they leave, they can continue to fix the problem themselves. And that's really kind of a different approach. And as we speak, there are 4 or 5 in Ghana.
5 in Ghana, 3 Americans, 2 Ghanaians.
Yeah. We have 5 members of the Humanist Service Corps in northern Ghana working at the witch camps there. And some people are shocked when they hear the term witch camps and find out that they're still doing witch hunts in Ghana, in Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, and that part of the world. And every year, huge numbers of people, almost all of them women or children, are ejected from their families, from their villages, where they have very little chance of survival. And they end up going to these witch camps and living in deplorable conditions. And so the Humanist Servant Corps volunteers in Ghana right now are helping to dig some wells. They are building a medical record system, giving an initial checkup first of all, so they can find out what might be wrong with each person, and then building a record system so that in the future, doctors that treat them have a roadmap. They know what's been going on, and that's something that they have not had up until now. And I like to use this as an example. People think that I'm an old curmudgeon, and I am. I was born a curmudgeon. And I sometimes joke around about those damn kids these days, but it's just a joke. And I like to use this as an example when people really do start complaining about the kids these days. These are a bunch of 20-somethings that literally left everything they knew behind, a comfortable, privileged life in America, to go to a foreign country and help people they've never met. We should all be so lazy, right? We should all be so committed. And then almost 4 years ago, I was hospitalized with what everyone thought at the time was a heart attack. My heart rate got as high as 220 beats per minute, and it wouldn't slow down. And for the first few days, they had no idea what was wrong with me. They thought I was having a heart attack, and then they put a catheter up into my arteries and said, "Your arteries are clear." And my first thought was, with all the barbecue I eat, how in the world could my arteries possibly be clear? They should be solid by now, you know. But you know, it was a very scary time, and I you know, there were several days where I thought there was a very real possibility that I was going to die. And after I got out of the hospital, I had several people ask me, you know, so did you have any epiphanies? You know, did you have any blinding flashes of insight while you were facing death? And my response was, I was just too busy trying to stay alive to think on that level. I mean, maybe other people can, but I couldn't at that point at least. And that was true, but over the next few months, as I thought about it more, it only reinforced the path that I had already begun. It continued to push me in this direction of identifying less as an atheist and more as a humanist. And if I had one revelation or epiphany, it was that the thing I had slowly begun figuring out, that humanism is more important to me than atheism, was something I had had modeled for me my entire life. My father, who turned 81 years old in June, has been an atheist since he was 16 years old. And from my earliest childhood memories, he was the kind of person that if someone needed you, he was there. If he possibly could be, he was there to help. And it wasn't something you had to sit down and weigh the pros and cons of or the costs and benefits of. It was, this is what a decent person does. It's automatic. And I watched him do that for a very long time. When I was about 19 years old, my freshman year in college, I got a phone call from my dad. And it said, "Your Uncle Richard has AIDS." My dad's younger brother. My namesake, my first name's actually Richard. But I go by my middle name. Richard is actually the person I was named after. And he said, "Richard has AIDS." And this was 1986, so this was when AIDS was still a death sentence. And it was a devastating phone call, obviously. And I hung up. When we hung up, I remember thinking to myself, my parents aren't going to handle this well. My stepmother's Pentecostal, fundamentalist, all the sort of typical anti-gay views that come with that. And my dad was an atheist, but he was born in 1935. Men of that generation, as a general rule, it just wasn't accepted, religious or not. And then 2 weeks later, my dad called me back and he said, "Richard's coming to live with us." I said, "What?" And my parents had what was then called a mother-in-law's apartment. Had a kitchen, had its own bathroom. He could have his own privacy, and right across the breezeway were people who could help him if something went wrong. My dad had called him up and said, "You're going to need someone to care for you, and it's going to be me." And I was incredibly proud. So after a while, the first couple of years were really rough. Richard had to kill himself a couple of times. This is very common for people who contracted AIDS in that day, because there was just no hope of survival long term. But after the first couple of years, finally Richard woke up one day and decided he was going to do something positive with his life. Whatever time he had left, he was going to try to make a difference. And he and my dad started looking for houses in Kalamazoo. And they found this old, rundown, massive house and bought it and turned it into something called the Rainbow House. And it was kind of a halfway house for people who had AIDS, who were HIV positive, but weren't yet acutely ill, but would still need some care. And they bought it, and we went in over one summer and remodeled it all into apartments. And they knocked on thousands of doors probably, and talked doctors and nurses and nutritionists and therapists and others to volunteer, each of them a few hours a week, so that there was enough collective help that the people there got what they needed. And to fund this, my uncle then started something called the Rainbow Resale Shop. He had a background in clothing. He had owned several clothing stores. And over the next few years, we spent countless hours, but my dad in particular, thousands and thousands of hours at that place, working the counter, tagging clothes, washing clothes, hanging clothes, to help fund this whole project. But it wasn't just him, it was my stepmother too. Despite her anti-gay views, she took care of him every day for 9 years. He lived for 9 years and was pretty healthy up until the last probably 8 or 9 months. And she took care of him. And I remember her saying one time, "I believe this is what Jesus would do. He would take care of this man. That's what you do for the people you care about." And the point is that I had grown up with these examples of humanism put into action in my life, in my father. No matter what the situation there, as I said, he was there to help others. To this day, at 81 years old, every Tuesday, he leaves the house and he joins up with a bunch of other old retired guys who are handy, and they call themselves the Tuesday Tool Men. And they go around town, and people put in requests for work to be done in their houses that needs to be done. And they put in that request with the local housing authority, and then they hand those off to the Tuesday Toolmen, and they put in handicap ramps and guardrails and fix people's roofs and all that kind of stuff. And he still does it, at 81 years old. And I'm a bit ashamed to realize that it took me until my 40s to even recognize the example that I had had in front of me all this time and to take it to heart. I also realized in writing this talk, and I had this memory of something that I had I had blocked it, it just wasn't something that was active in my head. My mother, my biological mother, with whom I didn't live, when my parents got divorced, I lived with my dad, kind of set that example to some degree too. So I would spend most of my summer vacation at Mom's house, but she and my stepdad both worked. So I would get bored sitting around the house all day. And you can only watch so many soap operas at 13 years old before you want to kill yourself. So she suggested there was a adult care facility just a couple blocks down the road. And for people who had serious health problems or were just old and infirmed. And she said, why don't you go down there and volunteer? And I said, volunteer to do what? I don't have any skills, I'm 13 years old, you know? And she said, just to go and sit and talk with people. I said, is that something that's needed? Yeah. So I went down there the next day and walked into the office and said, I'd like to volunteer to just sit and talk with some of your people, you know, 2-3 times a week. And they were just delighted to see that. And they assigned 5 patients to me. And it was a fascinating group. One was actually really young. He was probably not even 40 years old, but was in a wheelchair. And the only thing he ever wanted to talk about was baseball. He was just a savant of baseball. But there was one man, and I still remember his name. His name was Louis Crow. And Louis was a grizzled old World War II veteran. I mean, you could see every experience he'd had in his entire life chiseled into the wrinkles on his face. He had emphysema as well. And he was probably in his 70s anyway. And he was very well known around this facility for being just a mean old coot. And in fact, when one of the nurses took me in to introduce me to him, his response was, the hell would I want to talk to this kid for? So I kept coming back. 2-3 times a week I'd come back and say hi to him, and slowly he started talking back, and he'd tell stories, he'd rant about politics a little bit, he'd talk about his buddies he lost in the war, you know, that kind of thing, and I'd let him just listen to him, and sometimes I'd ask questions, but really he just wanted to talk, and he wanted to reminisce maybe a little bit. And over the course of several weeks, the rest of that summer, he kept warming up, and when I left, because I was going home, and I went to say goodbye to him, he asked me for a hug. And I was 13 years old, but I could tell that I'd made a difference to this man. But the truth is, I wasn't just helping him. He was changing me. And I don't think we should overlook this. I hear people talk about selfish motivations, right? You just do that because it makes you feel good. What the hell's wrong with that? That's a powerful human motivation, right? That's a positive motivation for people to do things for other people. Let's not belittle that. Let's embrace that idea, right? So here's the bottom line. When I tell someone that I'm an atheist, all I'm telling them is what I don't believe about one thing. When I tell them I'm a humanist, now I'm telling them what I do believe about a whole range of things. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying don't call yourself an atheist. I'm not saying don't be an atheist. I call myself that. I have no intention of stopping. I think it really is important. And Dave Silverman of American Atheists, he and I have some disagreements on this, but I agree with him when he says it's important to use that term. In a society that still is bigoted against atheists and has negative stereotypes of them, taking that stigma away and making it safer for other people to embrace it is important, and we ought to do it. So I'm not suggesting that you stop calling yourself that. What I'm suggesting, nor am I suggesting that it isn't important to spend time opposing bad ideas, bad religious ideas in particular. It's very important. And it's often not possible to fight for good ideas like justice, equality, and fairness without criticizing the bad ideas, which are quite often, maybe most of the time, based on religion. And those structures that religion builds into society prevent us from solving those other problems. But I fear that many atheist activists have become sort of obsessed with the battle, they feel so zealous about it sort of advancing the fight against religion that they've forgotten that it's also necessary to do something and build something that's an alternative to that. A place where people who are leaving religion want to go and feel like they can make a difference. I think that's really, really important. Because here's the thing, even if religion disappeared tomorrow, sexism doesn't go away automatically. Racism doesn't go away automatically. Homophobia doesn't go away automatically. It's still going to take generations to rebuild those societal structures and ideas to embrace a positive view of other people and of diversity. There's a popular Christian book. I'm guessing many of you are ex-Christians, as I am. There is a popular Christian book called How Then Shall We Live? That asks that very question. So, they ask the question, now that we are followers of Jesus, how then shall we live? But you can ask that question from a humanist perspective as well. Once we've figured out that there isn't a God up there that's going to come down here and fix our problems for us, how then shall we live? Well, I think we live by taking responsibility not only for our own lives, but for the lives of others as well. We start by not just pointing out a problem, but doing something to help fix it. We start by taking to heart the very important idea that we are our brother's keeper and our sister's keeper. And that when others are treated unfairly, discriminated against, spat upon by the rest of society, and pushed into corners of invisibility, so that the rest of us can go about our daily lives without having to think about them, hungry or sick or homeless, that it is our responsibility not to just shake our heads and think, oh, what a shame, but to actually do something about it. And one of the things that occurred to me as I was writing this talk was that, and actually it was a friend of mine that kind of suggested this, because I was talking about this idea of corners of invisibility, and how people who aren't compassionate will push homeless people, for example, off into these corners of invisibility. If I don't see them, I don't have to think about them, right? But it isn't just those people. It's also very compassionate people that do that, because we get overwhelmed. There's so many problems to fix that you feel overwhelmed and you get compassion fatigue. And so I think the secret to this, to overcoming this or avoiding this, is to focus A, hyper-locally, and B, on just one or two or three things that you can do in your local community. And if all you can do is go volunteer to 3 hours a week to read to a child, or drop off books for a book drive for kids who don't otherwise have access to it, or serve dinner at a homeless shelter, that's enough. You don't have to fix all the world's problems at once. Bishop Tutu once famously said, do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. Most importantly, we start by building communities of people who are committed to doing the same thing, because we cannot do it alone. And I believe very strongly in the idea of building secular communities. And this is one of them. This is one of the largest humanist communities maybe in the world, I think Vic said. And so you guys have already a part of it, and I'm sure you already do charitable things here in Houston, and that's a wonderful thing. And then once we build those communities, join them up with other communities, both of like-minded people and not like-minded people, because we can achieve more sort of exponentially if we pool those resources. This past year, CFI Michigan had a really tough situation. Samantha Bannister, some of you may have heard of her, was a young girl at 11 years old who was diagnosed with a rare brain tumor. And her parents are very dear friends of mine that live just a couple miles away from me. And I was so proud of how the community stepped up. I mean, just people coming out of the woodwork to cook meals for them, to clean their house, to watch the younger kids while they had to be at the hospital with Sammy. It was really an extraordinary thing. And they helped make things easier on this family that was going through like the worst thing imaginable. I mean, many of you here have kids. Can you even imagine what that would be like? Communities make that easier. And not one of those people did it because they didn't believe in God, or because they did. They did it because they are human beings who looked at other human beings and saw themselves. We see ourselves and people collectively in all of our fragile glory. None of us immune to tragedy. None of us all of us dependent on other people for so much. And it is in that interdependence that we find the meaning and motivation to do unto others as we hope they would do unto us if the tables were turned. So my plea to you tonight, be an atheist or an agnostic or whatever you are, and be that proudly. That's important, but don't stop there. It isn't enough. If we're ever going to put an end to injustice and inequality, bigotry, poverty, discrimination, we're going to have to work together. Talk, as they say, is cheap. There is much work to be done, and I say let's get started. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you very much, Ed, for the incredibly powerful talk. We do have plenty of time for Q&A, and so if you'd like to go ahead and I'll move the mic over here in the middle. If anybody has questions, come on up in the middle and feel free to ask. Just do ask. We do have plenty of time, but do ask. Please be respectful of other people's time, and so do not ramble and on and on. So
Please phrase your filibuster in the form of a question.
Yeah, please phrase your filibuster in the form of a question. And, at least have a question too, please. Okay, so.
I'm gonna break the ice.
Okay.
Okay, Ed, you have your blog, Dispatches of
From the Culture Wars.
Wars. I'm curious, what are some of the most popular posts on your blog, if you can remember or talk about those? Just curious.
One of them came about 2 or 3 weeks ago when I didn't anticipate this at all. In fact, I posted it on a Sunday thinking, which is the slowest day for page views. I thought I was just giving a little advice to my readers, and it turned into a massive shitstorm. When I posted a list of liberal clickbait, dishonest sites that I wish my fellow liberals would stop citing constantly on my Facebook feed because it makes me stabby and makes me bash my head into the desk. And it just blew up like I couldn't believe. And a bunch of the people who write for or own some of those websites showed up, losing their minds over it, and sent their readers to tell me what a horrible human being I am. And my response is, look, I knew that. I live with myself every day. So that's one that really blew up just recently. It's weird the way my blog has grown over the years in that, it's in November 9th, it'll be 13 years that I've been blogging. So I got in like really early in the whole blogging phenomenon. And starting it with no thought that it would be anything other than something a few of my friends might read. And almost immediately I got involved in this big sort of blogosphere-wide fight, or at least legal blogosphere-wide fight, over the meaning of the Ninth Amendment. And those of you who read my blog know that I'm kind of a con law fanatic, a con law geek. I love constitutional law. It's my favorite thing to write about. And I got into a big fight over that with some rather prominent law professors. And that was sort of the first jump in readership. That was when I went from like 50 readers a day to 300 or 400. And I remember the first day I went over 100 hits, just going, oh my God, 100 people read what I wrote, which today makes me sound silly. And it just sort of ratcheted up as I got involved in some of these big fights, and that would bring me more readership. And I didn't do it for that reason. They were just topics that were interesting to me, because never in a million years could I have imagined that I'd actually make a living at it at some point. I wouldn't even have thought to think that, it was so remote. I was just, like I said, the voices in my head rattle the monkey cage a lot. And I have to write about it. So, there were these big sort of milestones along the way. And it peaked at about 35,000 page views a day. So far, at least. But, yeah, I know it's only a partial answer to your question.
Well, I guess I'll help break the ice a little more. But I don't want to stray too much away from the main focus of your talk. But just kind of tying into Noel's question is, I spoke with you yesterday where I kind of told you I kind of think of you as the ombudsman of the atheist movement, which kind of meaning that you often in many of your writings you're actually calling out other atheists, other people in the atheist community for maybe where they use intellectual dishonesty, or whether inadvertent or inadvertent, but where perhaps atheists sometimes resort to the tactics that the other side engages in that are not necessarily appropriate or ethical, or just wrong, or when they're just simply wrong, when people have wrong-headed arguments. So I'm curious about, was that kind of a conscious thing that you decided you wanted to kind of take on and serve that role? And also, can you also kind of talk about maybe some of the reactions that you've gotten, the backlash you've received as a result of oftentimes, I guess you could call it criticizing other people in the atheist movement?
Yeah, well, I am apparently a well-known Christian sock puppet out to destroy the atheist community. I've heard that one a few times. A shill for big Christianity or something. It wasn't a conscious decision to do that. It was, again, the monkeys in my head banging on the cage, because I see so many just bad arguments. So much tribalism. And this is sort of the bottom line of all of this, is people, and we all do this, I do it too, I've been caught at it myself. When we identify with a group, when we have a fixed ideological perspective, then we tend to filter out evidence to the contrary or arguments to the contrary. That's called confirmation bias. Psychologists understand this whole thing pretty darn well. And it's these ways that our brains make cognitive shortcuts to reach conclusions, or to preserve our already reached conclusions in the face of evidence to the contrary. It is a very human thing to do. It's not, and it's something we have long criticized Christians for, of course, but then we magically lose the ability to identify those same tactics when they're used by people on our side, because they're part of our tribe, and we don't want to blow the whistle on people on our tribe, and I'm just a big opponent of tribalism in general. I just think it leads to sloppy thinking, and quite frankly, I expect better out of my people. Atheists spend a lot of time declaring to the world how smart and rational we are. And then go off and make some absolutely terrible argument that if it were made by a Christian, we'd stomp them into the ground rhetorically. And so I think I really got started on that with the atheist memes, which is probably a couple of years ago. And I'm sure most of you are on Facebook, and memes have now become the only currency in the world on Facebook. And some of them are just so bad. The arguments are just so irrational.
Can you mention?
Well, yeah, I do a whole series on my blog. It's continual. It's called Stupid Atheist Memes. And what particularly bothers me is when people think they found this completely simplistic explanation for religion. Like, oh, people only believe in God because they're afraid of dying. People only believe in God because it's a tool of control. People only believe in God because they're brainwashed. And I'm thinking, this is like one of the most eternally lasting institutions in human history, maybe the permanent, humans have been religious since the beginning of human civilization, right? Before civilization, even. We have evidence of burial rituals going back to Homo erectus. And so if you think that you can just dismiss something that huge and that universal with just some sort of throwaway dismissal like that, you're thinking at about a third grade level, Religion is way more complicated than that. And honestly, part of what motivates me to fight against those things is because I'm quite embarrassed to say, I used to say some of those things. When I was in my 20s, I was the classic arrogant young atheist who thought he had answers to everything, who thought that every religious person was a total idiot. The problem was I kept running into religious people that weren't total idiots. They were very intelligent people. And so, over time, I sort of had to obviously moderate my views a bit on this. I can give you some examples of arguments I really hate. I really hate the "we're all born atheists" argument. No, we're born without any ability to be a theist or an atheist. And there's actually some pretty good theory and research to suggest that the roots of religious belief are in fact built into our brains. Dualism is pretty strongly built into our brains. Agency detection. The person who lived longer in prehistoric times was the one who presumed that the rustling wind was something coming to kill him and not just the wind kicking some leaves around. We detect agency in things, and so we begin to assign everything happening in nature to some force. Right? Why did it storm on us and flood our house? Well, the rain gods are angry with us. In fact, I really believe that religion is our first attempt at science. It was our first attempt, as a species, to explain the natural world. They didn't have the tools of science back then, so they invented gods. And so I just think we tend to just oversimplify and too casually dismiss religion with these little sort of throwaway lines, just flippant, No, religion's a lot more important and powerful than that. And that doesn't mean it's true, but deal with it as it really is and not as this sort of cartoonish caricature, So, and the same thing with the liberal memes. That's sort of equally irritating to me now that we have these websites that, liberal websites that just use fake quotes from people. I really got started with it there's a group on Facebook called Stop the World the Teabaggers Want Off. And I was literally seeing dozens and dozens of times every day people on my Facebook page sharing these memes from them that were just quotes from some always prominent conservative. And then they would have a date and a source, Unbelievably stupid quote, and then it would say, 10, 12, 16, Sean Hannity show or something, But all of the quotes were fake, every single one of them. And those people look plenty bad on their own quoting what they actually say, right? There's no reason to make shit up. And yet they do. And so many of my Facebook friends, and again, this goes back to tribalism, this goes back to confirmation bias. It confirms what I already believe to be true, and therefore it is true. And I'm not going to bother to check and see if it's true. I'm going to assume that it is. And it began with me just responding to people and going, 10 seconds of Googling would have shown you this was fake. That's all it takes. Stop sharing misinformation with the world. That's what we criticize the other side for doing, and you're doing it yourself. And I'll give you a very prominent example of this. How many people here know who Donald Prothero is? Very famous skeptic, geology professor, very good geology professor. He's written several very fine books on geology and paleontology. He blocked me on Facebook probably a year and a half ago because every single day he would share completely fake memes. I mean, half a dozen of them, a dozen of them a day. It's the only thing he ever posted on Facebook. And I started out being very nice about it and saying, Donald, stop doing this. Do a little research before you share stuff. You know, you're a skeptic. You declare yourself a skeptic. The world views you as a very prominent skeptic. You're letting skepticism down by doing this. Never said a word, never responded to anything, any of my comments on that. And after about a dozen times of this, I just unloaded on him. And then he sent a bunch of his fans to attack me and blocked me. And I'm told to this day, I can't see his Facebook page, but I've had many people who've told me that they're still friends with him, and they go, yep, he still does it every day. You know, and the excuses that are made are so stupid. God, I had friends of him making arguments like, well, he just doesn't take Facebook seriously. I said, that's like saying I don't take the telephone seriously. Facebook is a means of communication. When you are communicating information to other people, if you're going to call yourself a skeptic, it damn well better be good information, right? And I got to the point where I don't know how many times I've said this in a Facebook comment, I can't believe I have to explain this to people. What the hell is wrong with this, you know? And so, yeah, the more it goes on, the angrier I got about it, I think. And when I get angry about stuff like that, I tend to get very, very snarky and even abusive and get to the point where I just go, oh, shut up, you're a moron. In fact, I reached that point probably way more quickly than I should, especially for somebody who just gave a talk about the importance of human compassion. Sorry.
It's a process.
Yes, it's the process. No, please.
My name is Rashid. As you have correctly said that merely being an atheist is not sufficient. In your opinion, to what extent it is correct that most atheists, they involve in activities imparting humanism, as atheists are the ones who become atheists having studied hundreds of hours and rejecting discriminative elements of religion. And my second question is that with your vast knowledge and experience, what do you think that early man, early Homo sapien, they used to be atheist, or they straight away invented God and religion to live their lives?
I didn't understand your first question. Could you restate that?
As you said that being merely atheist is not sufficient.
Right.
One should involve in activities imparting humanism, rejecting discrimination,
Sure.
I mean, whatever positive in order to make our society better.
Yep.
So this is what most of the atheists are doing. This this is what I perceive, that most of the atheists,
Okay.
they are involved in. To what extent it is correct?
I mean, I don't know. I haven't taken a poll on this or anything. Clearly, there's going to be an awful lot of overlap, right? Clearly, most atheists are going to consider themselves humanists, and most humanists will consider themselves atheists, although there are religious humanists out there as well. So, yeah, an awful lot of atheists are doing this wonderful work every day, and I hope they continue, and we should all commend them and commend one another for the work that we're doing. But it's not enough. And I think like I said, I think there's a lot of particularly well-known atheist activists who have gotten so caught up in just being anti-religion. We gotta bash religion, we gotta bash it all the time, that they've forgotten about this idea of what's an alternative. When someone leaves the church, they're not just leaving an idea or a set of ideas behind. They are very often leaving their entire community behind. Their entire system of support, that's all they've ever known. What are we offering to those people as an alternative? If we aren't building something to offer them as an alternative, this is a slightly different subject from humanism in action. It's the importance of building secular communities that offer something welcome for them and offer a whole bunch of different things to welcome them, because different people's needs different people have different needs, and they have different needs at different points in their lives. And so, for example, CFI Michigan, which I'm on the board of, we do about 270 events a year of all different types. Everything from a Living Without Religion support group, which tends to attract people who have recently left religion behind and are looking for others of that same thing to sort of, talk out what they're going through, to bi-weekly lectures, to Skeptics in the Pub, which is just an informal gathering, cafe inquiry. So there's a whole bunch of things, but they don't tend to draw all the same people. In fact, there tends to be not a lot of overlap between most of those, because people have different needs at different points in their lives. It's important for us, I think, to build those secular alternatives. And it's important for us, if we're going to say we want to see the power of churches diminished, which I think we agree we do, well, part of that includes funneling all of this money and time and effort into charitable works. So are we just going to let that float away and never exist again? No, as secular communities, we have to pick up that mantle ourselves. And so that's sort of my answer to the first question. Second question, look, I'm not an anthropologist. We have one over here. We could ask her, but in my sort of, I think reasonably well-educated layperson, no, I don't think they were atheists. I think they invented gods. I think that's where religion comes from, is prehistoric man. I hate the word prehistoric because what comes before history? Never understood that. But, like I said, we have evidence of religious rituals, burial rituals going back 2 million years, Homo erectus. Maybe not that long, maybe it was later. What's that?
Neanderthal versus.
Yeah, but that wasn't near that long ago. But even in human Homo erectus, at least later on, yeah.
When anthropologists use the term prehistoric man, it really means before writing.
Yeah, pre-civilization, permanent encampment. So yeah, that's where religion comes from. So no, I don't think they were atheists. But then obviously religions became more sort of codified around 10,000 years ago when human civilization began. We began to settle down in permanent encampments. We started using agriculture, domesticating agriculture, and so on. And that's when ideas begin to coalesce and codify and formalize. And that's where religion comes from. And it's not an all bad thing. I mean, that helped to unify people in many ways. It helped to give them a common purpose. It gave them a creation, an understanding of their own history, even if it was wrong, which in most cases it is. So religion plays powerful positive roles in people's lives too, which is why I think it's so important for secular communities to have ways to provide those same benefits to people. So again, that goes back to the idea of community building more than humanism.
What's the most interesting place you've ever visited and why?
Oh boy. You stumped me with that one.
That could be a nation, it could be a city, it could be a group of people.
Wow.
It could be, let me help you with that.
Here, right now.
Are you from Houston?
No, I'm from Michigan. This is my second time in Houston. So.
Okay. Tell us about Michigan and how you see it as different.
I tend to sort of dismiss.
From a cultural and a religious perspective, and the integration of religion into their world versus other places that you see.
Well, Michigan is sort of split in half. And the eastern half of the state is Detroit, which is in the far eastern part.
I can hear you better up here.
The eastern part of the state is Detroit and over to Lansing. And then the western part is Lansing over to Lake Michigan, and that includes Grand Rapids, which is where I live. Grand Rapids is a very conservative Christian community. And that's one of the reasons why I think our organization there has been around for 20 years and continued to grow. Because when you're surrounded by a hostile religious culture, as a non-believer, you circle the wagons to get support, you know. And so that's a big divide, like almost right down the center of Michigan. And it's almost entirely conservative or Christian Reformed, Dutch Reformed in that part of the state where I live. So, but I tend to not take seriously the sort of provincialism that says the place that I'm from is so special. Because you know what? Everybody thinks the place they're from is special, unless they hated it and want to get away, you know. I hate when I hear, you know, oh, New Yorkers will recover from this because they're tough. Like they're the only tough people in the damn world, you know. The fact is, people are pretty much the same everywhere, you know. And so when we sort of, and we tend to stereotype negatively in that way, you know, the South is just a bunch of dumb hillbillies. Well, no, they're not. You know, it's just become such a stock lane joke that, you know, but we've bought into it. So I don't think there's anything particularly special about Michigan. It's a beautiful state. It's fabulously beautiful. We're surrounded by 20% of the world's fresh water in the Great Lakes, and that makes it a really lovely place. But the people here aren't any different than the people anywhere else, I think, for the most part. I'll say this. August 31st, 2017, I'm spending 11 days in France and Spain with a dear friend of mine and my old high school French teacher, who is also 81 like my father, and not in particularly good health. And I have a good friend of mine who's getting married in France, and that was where the whole idea came from, to take this trip. And then I decided to invite Louis, my old French teacher, who has been a huge mentor to me, next to my father, the biggest intellectual influence on me throughout my life. And I just think that's going to be an amazing trip to see France through his eyes. And he's lived there. He lived there for 15 years or so. To see his France, I think it's going to be a very different thing than just taking a trip to France. So I suspect if you ask me that question a year from now, that'll be my answer.
So I'll ask you another question about a term you used, which was non-believer.
Yeah.
Okay. So non-believer, I've been called a non-believer, and people explain to me that they don't think I believe in anything. And of course, we do believe in quite a bit, and I think we believe more than others believe, and we have faith in that this non-accepted belief system takes a lot of faith to defend. Give us some clues on how to work that and defend it and explain what we
Can you
know.
restate that last part of it? Because I'm not sure I
don't know if
got
I
the
can.
thrust of it.
All right, so we're talking about humanists being accused of not believing in anything. But in fact, I think we do believe in quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I believe that we do have strong faith because we believe in things that are not widely accepted. That requires a lot of faith in the idea that we believe in. So help us explain being a non-believer, and help me explain that to other people, and what it is that we do believe in, and where's the best
Okay.
sources.
Well, that I can do. Maybe I'm getting stuck in terminology. I wouldn't equate non-believer with humanist.
Thank you.
I mean, non-believer is a term I probably shouldn't have used. We're all non-believers, right? We all have a billion things we don't believe in. But it's sort of a handy shortcut for atheists, you know. Yeah, you hear this idea a lot that atheism is nihilism, you know, which is profoundly silly. But you know, in terms of what humanists believe, I mean, Vic had read what the American Humanist Association definition is, which is pretty brief, and there's a lot more that can be said about that. But I think that humanism is primarily the belief that human beings are the ones in control of our own condition. We're the ones that make life, that make Earth heaven or hell. Those don't exist outside of the Earth. We make Earth heaven or hell depending on how we behave toward others, and even how we behave toward ourselves. And the idea that we are, first and foremost, we are a social species. We don't, live in as individuals without contact with other people. We aren't recluses. We form complex societies. And when you form complex societies, that brings a whole bunch of needs that need to be met. And that the best way to go about meeting those needs is by pooling collectively our talents together and by showing compassion to other people. And of course, I could go on all day long about this, but you know, that's sort of the basic idea, I think. There are some more sophisticated criticisms of humanism from a philosophical perspective, none of which I'm particularly well prepared to answer. In fact, my roommate, who is Justin Schieber, who is used to be on the Reasonable Doubts podcast and is a very serious philosophy student, doesn't consider himself a humanist for philosophical reasons. That doesn't mean he doesn't agree with the idea that we ought to help other people. Of course he does, but he doesn't consider himself a humanist, and he doesn't think that there's a solid epistemological basis for humanism any more than there is for religion. And I hope I'm restating his position accurately. So there's sort of this arguments on different levels. You can explain this at this very basic level. There's also a great deal of philosophical literature on the idea of humanism where they argue back and forth in a philosophy of religion. Much more sophisticated arguments that, quite frankly, I'm not qualified to attempt to answer, so I won't.
You mentioned David Silverman and his advocacy for calling yourself an atheist. I just wanted to hear your argument for not necessarily calling yourself an atheist.
Well, but that's not my argument. In fact, I said emphatically several times during this speech.
Well, when other people call themselves humanists or non-believers.
Well, see, that's where I part company with Dave.
Right, that's what
He
I wanted to
thinks
hear
you should. I think he thinks that you should exclusively call yourself
Right.
an atheist.
Right. In his book, Finding God,
Yeah.
he's very adamant about that.
And that's where I part company with Dave. I think you should do, if you are an atheist, call yourself that. If you are a humanist, call yourself that too. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram. I don't think we should limit ourselves to one term exclusively because it serves some political purpose, you know. And I'll tell you a funny story about Dave at the Reason Rally this year. I was actually sitting there visiting with Noel in the exhibitors tent, and David Silverman was at the table next door, or at the table next to us, and he was signing books. And I don't think you were actually at the table when this happened. I think Vic might have been. But I walked over there and said hi. You know, hi Dave. Hey Ed, how you doing? And he said, Ed, have you read my new book? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, well, you know, Ed, it was written for people just like you. And I said, you mean spineless, weak-kneed religion appeasers like me? And he said, oh, I don't consider you to be spineless. And we shared an awkward laugh, and I walked away. And in the purposes, I like Dave. Dave's a great guy. He's on a personal level, like him very much. We have some disagreements in approach and tactics on these things, but you know, personally, I like him a lot. But so yeah, we just part company on some of that sort of thing. So, your turn, sir.
Yeah,
Finally.
thank you very much for your talk. It was most interesting, and I appreciate it very much. I certainly agree with you that we atheists must do more than just say we don't believe in God. That we have to address humanity and human concerns. Where I part company, however, is the idea that atheism only means not believing in God.
I agree with you
It
completely.
can mean much more than that. Now, you're undoubtedly familiar with Free Inquiry,
Oh, yeah.
published by the Council for Secular Humanism,
Yep.
which is part of the Center for Inquiry.
Yep.
And so you know that in the August-September issue, there was a discussion between Greta Christina and Tom Flynn, the director of the council, on what does atheism mean. And I would like, if I might read just briefly something, some part of what Greta Christina wrote.
I know Tom's position on this, and although Greta Christina's a good
I'm
friend, I know Tom's position on this.
Yeah,
I haven't read this.
Okay, well then.
But I know what Tom thinks about this, and Greta's a good friend, but I don't know. I'm curious to know.
Well, yeah, I'll tell you
Tell
what,
me.
just, it's a whole article.
Okay.
For me, and for many other atheists, atheism has more than one meaning, depending on context. It can have the apparently simple meaning of lack of belief in any gods, which is the dictionary definition. It can also mean the values and ways of life implied by that conclusion or inspired by it. Some people use humanism to mean this. By all means, use that word if you prefer. And she goes on. Now, Tom Flynn's response, of course, is that people who go beyond that, who espouse the values that Greta Christina was talking about, might call themselves secular humanists. I, however, am with Greta Christina on this issue. I don't mind being called a secular humanist. A secular humanist, however, is the only kind of humanist that I would want to be called. I don't mind being called a secular humanist, but for me, being an atheist is quite sufficient. And when this question is, I've dealt with this question a good deal in groups that I have been involved with, the idea that atheism is not enough. You know, the American Humanist Association says atheism is not enough. Even the Council for Secular Humanism says beyond atheism, secular humanism. I refer people to the definitions of published by the American Atheist Association, David Silverman's organization, which go much beyond, for those who don't know, go much beyond just this simple lack of belief in God. The other comment that I would like to make is this. The evidence has convinced me that in balance, religion, that is belief in the existence of supernatural entities and forces, is on balance harmful to humans and their society.
I would agree.
Oh, well, then we don't have any argument on that. I would, however, go on to state that you said that even if religion were wiped out, we'd still have sexism and all kinds of other bad isms.
For at least quite a bit of time.
I think that wiping out religion would go a great distance in getting rid of those isms because they're rooted, many of them, in religion.
Right. My point was it just wouldn't instantly disappear, that we still would have to go about the work of breaking down those.
But, you know, religion is patriarchal.
Yes, absolutely.
So getting rid of that would go a long way in getting rid of sexism.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, okay.
And you know, your first comment about God, I just had a complete brain fart. Must have been something I read. What was your first question again?
Is atheism
merely a lack of belief in?
Does not mean only lack
Right.
of belief in the
I could have answered this to Vic's question as well. One of the other arguments that really irritates me that I hear from atheists all the time is this idea that atheism is nothing more than a lack of belief in God.
Yeah.
That's the only thing it is. Atheism is the default position, and the entire burden of proof is on the religious person. I think it's absolute nonsense. And it goes along with this argument about people are born atheists. Because I think those two are attempt to make the same idea that this is some sort of default position. And there's a couple of reasons I think that's wrong. And let me comment on the whole idea of atheists being, or babies being atheists. They're not capable of ever making that judgment. So when somebody says, a baby is an atheist, and I think I'm an atheist, but I'm an atheist because I spent a hell of a lot of time studying this stuff to reach a rational conclusion. Baby didn't have to do that. I think that's kind of insulting, right? If they're atheists only in the most monumentally trivial sense, right? If you are an atheist, you have heard of religion, right? Babies haven't. You have taken the time to go through a critical thought process to reach the conclusion that the arguments for religion are not convincing. Which means in an argument or a discussion with a religious person, You shouldn't just get to say, I don't take any position at all, burden's totally on you. Nonsense. You have reached a reasoned conclusion. Be prepared to defend that reasoned conclusion. So that's another atheist argument that really irritates me.
If I may just, I think when people say that, people are born atheists. All they mean by that is that we are born without religious belief. We have to first, most people I guess, first acquire religious beliefs before they go through the process.
But we are also born without knowledge of mathematics.
Of course.
We are, and that, by that argument, you could say all babies are global warming denialists, right? It's just such a nonsensical position,
Yeah, but
really.
it's used only in the meaning that people are born without religious belief. They have to
It's
acquire
used to counter a specific argument. It's used to counter the Christian argument that we are all born with an innate knowledge of God. That argument is bullshit.
Yes.
But you don't answer a bullshit argument with another bullshit argument. You point out that argument is bullshit. You know? So I just think there's a much better approach to all of that. Don't respond with an equally dumb claim, you know. But yes, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that on balance, religion has done far more harm to the human race than it's done good. My point was only that let's not throw away all of the good stuff and pretend it doesn't exist. It's not a universally bad thing, right? It really does provide comfort to people. It really does provide us a community of support for people going through difficult times. Just like what CFI did with the Bannister family, churches do that every day too. And that's a very valuable thing, no matter what the motivation for it. So let's not just pretend that it's totally negative. But yes, on balance, I think pretty clearly so. It's done more harm than good. So.
I want to also thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I discovered your blog about 6 years ago, and
we've been
that
friends on
period-
Facebook for a very long time.
Yeah.
You probably noticed I kept looking at you because you were a recognizable face, because I've seen it on Facebook so many
Yeah,
times.
and I really
So.
appreciate your voice of reason, you know, and over these years I've kind of gone from Catholic to liberal Christian to, you know, I don't find this stuff useful anymore, you know, but I had two questions. One is, tell us how you first got on the Rachel Maddow Show and how many times you've been on and how that happened, because I love her. One of the things that I've done this last year is stop drinking and start going to AA. And when you go to AA, you hear a lot of God. And in Austin next month, there's going to be a atheist and agnostic AA convention, which I think is going to be real interesting. I'm
Really
going to go. And so I wanted to see if you had any involvement in trying to find secular ways for people to deal with addictions, you know, because I know there's problems when courts award
Big problem, yeah.
send people to AA, and it does them a lot of good, but they don't need to have religion forced on them. So
Or sometimes to even not AA, but to, like we had a case in Michigan, court case that went on for several years of a guy who was actually sent to a Pentecostal alcohol and drug rehab center and he was Catholic, where they took away his Catholic Bible and his rosary and told him that if he didn't become Pentecostal, they wouldn't pass him out of the program and he'd go to jail.
Yeah, that's
You know,
crazy. That's gotta be. Also, I wish I would have brought my 13-year-old son tonight. He became an atheist kind of on his own, even before I thought I was. And it's probably because I sent him to Baptist summer camp one summer and he came back. But thanks a lot.
So the story about the Rachel Maddow Show is that in January 2010, I was getting ready. I was doing a radio show at the time, and I was in the studio preparing for the show, which was 2 or 3 hours later. This was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I get an email from one of her producers saying, here's my number, call me immediately, we want you on the show tonight. And so of course I called him immediately. I actually had already been asked to be on a show on Russia Today, and had said no, because the propaganda outlet for the Russian government. And so they wanted me to come on the show to talk about Bart Stupak, who is a Democratic congressman from Michigan. He is an anti-choice Democrat, or was. He's no longer in the Congress. And this was during the healthcare reform debates. This was the Obamacare debates and getting down to the final votes. And Stupak was blocking passage of it because it didn't ban all funding from Planned Parenthood. And so that's what she wanted me to show about. There was a couple other interesting aspects of that too that were only tangentially related. How many people here know what the C Street house is? Right? The house that the family or the fellowship, depending on which name they're going by that day, has in Washington, that is occupied by numerous members of Congress and the Senate. This is this sort of shadowy Christian right group in Washington that holds all prayer meetings constantly, and well, they had this house on C Street in Washington, and it had become the subject of a lot of talk on television. And I found out that Bart Stupak lived in it. He was one of the residents of the C Street house. At the same time, I had also discovered that he had put in an amendment to a defense spending bill to give a huge chunk of Coast Guard property to a church in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan free of charge, which is illegal. The Government Services Agency is required by law to put any surplus federal land up for sale on the open market and get fair market value for it. So we talked about Bart Stupak that first time. Interesting sideline to that. I had just moved into my house 5 weeks before that, maybe, December 2009. I hadn't met any of my neighbors yet. And they sent people to my house, a big satellite truck, cameraman. And so the neighbors are standing out there, there's this giant satellite truck, you know, and they're going, who the hell is this guy, right? And then about 6 weeks later, they were back again. And that time it was to talk about the Hutari Christian Militia, which was this Christian militia in southeast corner of Michigan that had been raided by the FBI and arrested because they were plotting to start a war with the police by killing one police officer and then bombing the funeral for that police officer to kill a whole bunch more of them. And so we had written a story about that. I was at the time the editor of a news site called the Michigan Messenger. And so those are the two times I was on there. And the really funny thing to me is that now I've had several people call me over the years and say, I got this story I want to get out there. Can you put me in touch with Rachel Maddow? And I'm like, you realize she couldn't pick me out of a police lineup, right? Like, I was at her show twice for a total of 12 minutes. I never talked to her except on the air. I talked to her producer. She has no idea who I am, none whatsoever. Much to my disappointment, because I would love to hang out with her. She seemed like a lot of fun. So that's the answer to that question. The C-SPAN one I've gotten asked about a lot with Chuck Norris, though. And that was a conference in Chicago in 2007. For many years, I made Chuck Norris sort of my personal punching bag, because he is a man of extraordinary stupidity. And he's a really hardcore Christian writer. And so I started making fun of him for it in talks that I gave. And this conference I spoke at in Chicago in 2007, C-SPAN was there to tape the whole thing, or the certain panels, and they taped our panel and aired it. And I actually had a slide of the South Park version of Chuck Norris, which is like a Yosemite Sam, rootin' tootin', you know. And another picture of him holding 2 machine guns, you know, like Jesus would. And the funny thing is, that made it on C-SPAN. They didn't cut that out, but they cut out a picture at the end of Bill O'Reilly and Ann Coulter hugging one another. So, and they left in a dirty joke that I did at the start of it. Because this was, you guys remember Mark Foley? Representative Mark Foley from Florida, who got caught, you know, texting lewd things to pages and all of that. And he was a big time, you know, Christian right, gays are evil, blah, blah, blah. Well, these were all male pages that he was doing this to. And so it was the first week of August in Chicago at McCormick Plaza. It was blistering hot. It was hotter than it is here in Houston, for crying out loud. And on top of that, we had the cameras, TV cameras from C-SPAN. And so, you know, we were just roasting. And the first thing I said when I got up there, I did this sort of ad-lib this joke. I said, you know, thank you for coming out on such an incredibly hot day. And I said, I don't know how it feels in the audience, but up here on the dais, we're sweating like Mark Foley at a Boy Scout jamboree. They left that in there. I just assumed that it's a C-SPAN, right? They'll cut that out. Nope. Put that in there. So, any other questions? Okay.